to me, I love those sort of disparity in recollections. I mean, that's what makes, to me, a great story and great history.
Welcome back to welcome, I guess, to an exclusive bonus special. How more important can I make this sound? Interview here on 1980s Now. Our show, which you probably know already, right, is an examination of the importance of 1980s pop culture and its influence right now. And this guest that I'm about to bring on, epitomizes that in the sense that, in the very least, not only did he live in the 1980s like we did and grow up in that era, but he wrote a book now, which was just published. It's available now, but it's about a really fun, or it's based on, loosely, on a fun, exciting incident that happened in the 1980s. So there you go. You got your 1980s and your now. And I'm talking about a radio contest that happened in Southern California that really did in the early 1980s, during an era where, you remember this, I'm sure, right? Radio stations, I don't know if they do this today anymore. They probably do, but there's a challenge with that, and I'm going to bring this up with our guest about how maybe there's just too much going on for these things to be special anymore. But back then, no matter where you are throughout the country, you listen to the radio, they undoubtedly had contests to get you to listen and get folks excited about being part of a community that were the listeners of this particular radio station. Well, in Southern California, it was no different. You had an AM station, so this is, before FM stations dominated the airwaves with popular music throughout the 1980s, because FM wasn't the go-to medium early on. That was a technology that was developed and then became more popular and because of the better quality of sound, as time went on. But here at the beginning of the 1980s, you had this AM radio station, the Mighty 690 in Southern California, that gave away $50,000 to attract new listeners and, again, get their base excited about being a part of this community. Let me know about what radio station you had in your area when you grew up and what kind of crazy things they may have done. Where I grew up, just across the Hudson River there from Manhattan in Jersey City, New Jersey, we had we had several New York radio stations, but the one that I gravitated most towards in my youth, in my younger years, and as I became a teenager, for a period of time was Z100, which was headed up by Scott Shannon. And Scott Shannon, brought all these great ideas to try to get attention to the radio station, including different giveaways. So, look, I got really excited about participating in those, including just the ones where you had to dial in real quickly and try to be the 100th caller. I was never the 100th caller. I just always got a busy signal, or someone told you what number you were and then hung up immediately. 70. It was really bad when you got really high, right, in the numbers there. 92, 95. Okay, just missed it. That sucked. Z100 also had a van that drove around, and if you could spot it in the wild, you'd get a T-shirt or something like that. Anyway, that was very exciting. Anyway, hey, let's bring out our guest, and we'll talk to him about his new book, The Mighty 690. Our guest today is the author of the Yesternow column that appeared in Southern California's OC Weekly between 2019 and 2021. His articles, which focused on pop culture history, were given 2 awards by the Los Angeles Press Club, where he was also nominated as Journalist of the Year in 2020. Our guest is also an attorney, which I find interesting, and I want to chat with him about this as having a similar background in that regard, but then turning to fiction. But as an attorney, he's also been a guest on CNN and Fox Business News, and has had his insights on trade, international business, and things that are much smarter than we cover on the show, featured in the Wall Street Journal and The Economist. But as I mentioned, today, he's going to chat with us about his new novel, The Mighty 690, a fictionalized account of the actual events that transpired in Southern California during the summer of 1981. And here's the synopsis, all right, if I wasn't clear enough. A struggling AM radio station buried $50,000 in cash and gave its listeners clues as to its location one a day until the money was found. Set against the backdrop of a California landscape very much in flux, the story resonates evenly between desperation, hope, and suburban dissonance. The book is available everywhere now, And we encourage you to support a local bookstore by getting your copy on bookshop.org. In fact, we put a link in the show notes below to make it real simple for you. Hey, please welcome to the show, Alexander Hamilton Cherin. How you doing, Alex?
Good. Thank you very much for having me.
All right, look, I just got to nerd out about a non-1980s thing now. I mean, did you get very excited when this Hamilton musical gets popular and your name is Alexander Hamilton Cherin?
I appreciate that. I lived most of my life, as you can imagine, with a love-hate relationship with my middle name. Mm-hmm. It is my mother's middle name. It's a family name. As an eighth grader, not so cool. But when the girl comes out, it gets you there a little bit. So I appreciate you bringing that up.
It would have been cooler in elementary school had he won the duel.
For sure. For sure. To be on the losing end of that, not so good. But didn't really use it much when I was younger. When I started to kind of get a little bit more comfortable with who I was creatively, it's a little easier to use now. So thanks.
So speaking about creativity, though, or discovering who you were creatively, as you said, you were a lawyer by training, an award-winning journalist. At what point do you make a decision to try fiction?
So it's a great question. I really sort of struggled with who I am creatively for a lot of years. Obviously grew up in a family with both my parents were college professors, both focused on reading and literature, and was obviously drawn to creative writing then. But then the 80s came along, and there was, a lot of focus on sort of the material aspects of what you need to do for your profession. And, you need to get a good job, and you need to go to grad school. And so, went down that path and, practiced law for a number of years. And really, I found it interesting, but it really didn't fulfill, any creative need I had. So was lucky enough towards the end of my legal career to find an editor for a local paper, the OC Weekly here in Orange County, California, who I knew, and was looking for someone to fill the back page column for a column that had been disbanded up to that point called Yesternow, which was a little bit of a study of pop culture history in Southern California. And he really gave me an opportunity and turn that into creative writing on a more consistent basis. And then the book, The Mighty 690, which is actually coming out next week.
I'm a lawyer as well. And I remember, I don't practice, but I'm a licensed here in Ohio. But I remember I was part of a writing group, a creative writing group, not too many years ago. And I read a sample, and the old guy in the group who'd been there for, as long as the group existed and had, 30 books under his book, said, "What do you do for a living?" And I said, "I'm a lawyer." He said, "I can tell by the writing." So it sounds like writing for the OC maybe was a good bridge in a sense, because you were like the story you wrote about the summer of $50,000 for the OC first, kind of a bridge between focusing more on what actually happened versus your book, which takes some license.
Absolutely. So you know better than anyone, being a lawyer, that law school really pounds into you this notion of you have to write efficiently. Creativity is sort of disregarded by courts and by your audience and by your client. I mean, you really have to be an efficient, focused writer. And there's a need for that, as, you and I, found out as lawyers. But it really, it doesn't, at the end of the day, really satisfy, or wasn't satisfying for me. And so, finding this opportunity to write for the OC Weekly and do exactly what my law school, legal writing professors told me not to do, that was a fantastic exercise.
Yeah, I remember, I think it was in a legal writing class talking about writing complaints, where you have to tell a story, to try to win but don't go too far, Right. But you do get taught to have a tight story in a sense, which is better for even a novelist. Yeah,
absolutely. And, it's interesting because I can't shed that completely. So this book is short by most standards. There's some vestiges of that kind of legal writing that are still there, but much more creative than you'd ever find, or that I ever found in doing a legal brief or a complaint.
Now, as we mentioned, you had first written a short, again, more, accurate account, I suppose, of what happened of this contest that the Mighty 690 held in Southern California there in the early 1980s. Why did you choose this story to write your novel?
So, this, again, it's inspired by actual events. And as you mentioned, I wrote an article for the OC Weekly a few years ago, which was, more of a factual description of the actual contest. But I remember being 11 years old in the summer of 1981 in Southern California, and how fascinating I thought that this radio contest was. And I also, as I got older, realized that, one of the many things that the 80s provided was, we didn't have a lot of things to find commonality over. TV, radio were those things. And, as I'm raising kids now and we get further and further away from the 1980s, you realize that there is so much content and there are so many vehicles to provide content that we've sort of lost this these events of common interest. And so I really started to think about that. And I think it was probably one of the last instances of this contest in 1981 where, really the entirety of Southern California, and, regardless of socioeconomic status or what part of SoCal you lived in or what your educational background was. I mean, this was really a thing that everybody could relate to.
And I guess just to be clear for folks, we're talking about your book, The Mighty 690, which tells the story. And look, they had tons of, you point this out in your article and certainly in the book as well, that there were hundreds of these radio contests throughout the country even as FM became a more popular medium and folks are now vying for ears, giving away money, concert tickets, and the like. But this one was specific to this radio station that you heard there in Southern California, and they were giving away $50,000 if you could find it, given the clues. And your book tells a story of a number of different folks from different backgrounds attempting to do exactly that. Now, I remember when you wrote your piece, you point out that your recollection of what happened was not as romantic, or the reality of what happened was not as romantic as your recollection. But it's in your book, you more chose to lean on what you had thought had happened.
Or hoped had happened, right.
Had hoped it would happen.
Yes,
yeah.
I mean, the real contest took place over, the course of a week in the summer of 1981. And, the radio station would give out a clue every day over, 5 days as to the whereabouts of where the radio station had actually buried cash. And I mean, think about that concept today of actually burying $50,000 in cash. Nobody uses cash anymore.
Yep.
But I think, as I did my research for the article in the OC Weekly, found out that it was, just some random guy who happened to piece the clues together and found, the money. And it actually wasn't cash that was buried. It was a piece of paper, a license plate, somewhere in Redondo Beach, which to me was far less interesting than the possibilities. And so the possibilities had always stuck with me. And, what if, and I know that this contest appealed to a broad array of people from different backgrounds and really wanted to tie that together in the book.
Right. Yeah. I can't imagine how they determined it was behind this license plate even, especially since people like you thought it was buried. That's how it seemed to have been described.
Yeah.
I know the elephant was a clue and then so a trunk in the trunk of a car, but still that was pretty remarkable to me.
It was. And I was lucky enough to talk to a few years ago before I did the article for the OC Weekly to talk to one of the radio station managers who was there at the time. And he was good enough to walk me through it and said, look, they were really concerned that somebody that the money was not intended for would find it if they used actual cash. And so,
Sure.
Station management had told them that, it needed to be a slip of paper and they needed to verify that, the person was of age and, and all these things, which to me doesn't really lend itself to good fiction. And so again, I had a good time writing the article about the actual events, but I had a better time, I think, writing about the fictionalized version.
And, you mentioned folks being of age, and I imagine just for contest law purposes, you had to be an adult, you had to be 18.
Yep.
But, in your piece, you talk about how kids, teenagers would get their older brothers or their parents involved to go in this search. And I remember being a teenager getting excited about these types of contests on the radio too, not concerned with whether or not I could actually even be awarded the prize.
Yeah, that was something you worried about after the fact, right? It was, participating. It was about, doing these sort of communal things. And it's fascinating to me because, since I wrote this book, I've really tried to pay attention. Are there, instances like today? I don't think that this opportunity really exists. The 80s were a perfect time that everybody felt like, they had some skin in the game over these radio contests. And I just don't know if that kind of mass appeal exists today.
Yeah. So many of the things that we loved as kids obviously are gone. I was lamenting recently, I think it was a box of cereal that my daughter had that said, scan this QR code for a app.
Right.
I was like, well, what is this? I want to find that, Barney Rubble coin per pouch.
Exactly.
Whatever.
Exactly. Well, think about that. I mean, cereal boxes back then, you'd have to cut out the backs and literally put them in an envelope and mail them in with a stamp. None of things exist today. So I think the experience may be lost on this generation.
Yeah. And almost like you were saying about, and it's interesting, right? Because we think about, not to get too political, but certainly I think and even an apolitical person would say that we seem more divided than we did back in the 1980s. And what's curious is like what you were pointing out is how pop culture held us together, at least in some way.
For sure.
Because we had fewer choices. We had these cooler, water cooler type things to talk about.
Absolutely. I go back to the television landscape, which for a kid in the 1980s was everything. And, in Southern California, there were 6, maybe 7 channels, which meant 6 or 7 programs that you could choose from at night and talk to your friends about the next day. It really,
right.
It was a common thread of connection, which, as wonderful as the internet and streaming services are, it doesn't carry the same kind of ethos that it did back then.
Yeah, and having obviously there's more choice as far as content goes, but I wonder if, to your point about radio contests even, or contests generally today, that each one is, I imagine there's still tons, but they're diluted in a sense because there is so much choice. None of them has the impact that a, Summer of 50,000 would.
Agreed. I think that's right. And, I just think that choices have become very stratified, right? With streaming and with pop culture, you've got, every flavor on demand, and, people feel comfortable, staying in their boxes and, not necessarily venturing out. In the 80s, when you had more limited choices, I think it forced people to get out of their comfort zone a little bit and say, hey, this is what's out there and this is what's connecting people.
Yeah. And I know earlier you mentioned how when you did your piece in the OC that you spoke to a radio manager, and I think maybe that was Ted Zeigenbusch?
Yes.
And I know there was some discussion whether or not he came up with the idea for the Summer of 50,000 treasure hunt based on his experience as a kid or not.
Yes.
I know Michael Boss says maybe that's not true, but
yes. Well, it's interesting. So your history of the Mighty 690. So those, I did talk to Ted, and I very much used his childhood inspiration. Growing up in sort of further out from Los Angeles in the Inland Empire, and then there was some dispute as to whether Michael Boss actually came up with the contest. But to me, I love those sort of disparity in recollections. that's what makes, to me, a great story and great history.
Yeah. And I remember in that piece, you quoted Ted as saying that, you couldn't, with the, like you're talking about with regard to these other things, with the advent of social media, you couldn't do a treasure hunt type contest because the secret would get out, before the treasure was buried, I think he says.
Instantaneously. Think about that. There was some, there was some romantic notion of, hey, if you put a treasure hunt contest on, the buildup will be so fantastic that, people will listen and, they'll talk about it. And, those opportunities don't exist today. It would be instantaneous. We live in a culture now, in my opinion, unlike the 1980s, where we believe in, sort of this instant gratification. And I think that, back then, this contest or this type of contest worked because there was no internet, there was no email, there was no cable television. You really relied on your neighbors and getting outside as sort of your channel of communication.
Yeah. And I love how, in reality, in the short stories that we do know about what the folks that were going after it, and in your book, how people work together. You've got these different groups of people, and some folks have partners of sorts, and that you have, that they're having to lean on somebody in a way that today, you'd have somebody with an app and maybe want to just covet the entire 50,000 for themselves.
Correct. I mean, think of that concept of board games and how popular board games were in the 1980s, right? It forced you to work together and to be at the table together. And, you don't need to do that anymore. My kids play these games with their friends over text, and, why bother getting together?
You mentioned about, we were talking about the disparity, I guess, in accounts of what actually happened. And in your 2018 piece, I thought you made a great observation about how folks seem more interested in debunking myths today than actually celebrating them. And I agree with you. And one of the things that I want to find a magician from our time that we grew up watching to talk about this, because I am driven crazy, Alex, by people on TikTok who show a magician do a trick and then immediately show you how to do it. What is the point? It drives me crazy.
And not to be overly analytical, but I think that we really believed in the 80s, the late 70s and 80s as well, in kind of this anything is possible mentality. And now we live in a society of, it's not possible unless you show me, and you show me how to do it now. And we're really doing ourselves a disservice with that. I mean, you're absolutely right. I remember as a kid, the urban myths about, the poor kid who I think was from Ohio, but, people will tell me that he's from elsewhere, who ate Pop Rocks and drank a soda, exploded.
Right.
I don't want to know that that's false. I want to know that maybe that was possible. It forces people to talk about it. It forces, shared interests, shared commonalities, and who cares whether it's true or not.
That's funny. I could tell you that one. I'm not going to tell you that, but I could tell you.
Okay.
And I say all that, and now I remember that we did an episode where we were debunking urban myths from our childhood.
Right.
But and I'm gonna make a distinction.
Okay.
Between magic in that, and magic is magic. It's supposed to exist in that folks have it. There's sort of this suspension of disbelief. Where we come into wanting to believe this stuff. And I know you understand. Maybe it's different. Maybe it's not different because you want to believe these urban myths. The point of me with the urban myths was because simultaneously at the same time we have these cynical folks saying, I need to see it to believe it. You have a great swath of people that believe in utter nonsense without any proof of it.
It's ironic. It's ironic, for sure. And one of the things I try to point to in this book is that I think a lot of people with these urban myths, and, whether they believe them or whether they don't believe them, I think a lot of times act out of, a sense of, for lack of a better word, desperation, right? They want to believe in something. Whether it's, comical or whether it's inspirational. And I think that we have, sort of transitioned from, a time when this book, The Mighty 690, was written about people do things because they're desperate to some extent to want to find the truth because they hope it's true, to, we've transitioned to, people wanting to get to the bottom of the truth so they can show other people that they're wrong.
Yeah. It seems like that to me, even with the magic thing almost, that folks, it's an easy way for me to show that maybe I'm smart or I have knowledge.
Right.
Because I can debunk this one thing, or not debunk, that's not the right word. Revealing a trick is not debunking a trick. It's, whatever. Anyway, it's terrible. The folks at least look, we only have a little bit of information about the folks some of the folks that not only won the contest or competed to find the real treasure. We have a lot more information in your book because you wrote it, obviously. How did you go about picking the type of characters that you would portray in your fictional account?
So it's a good question. These I write from personal experience, and these characters in the Mighty 690 are all based on, people that I knew or observed or interacted with as a child. And right around that time in 1981, where the contest in the book is set, where people were moving away from the cities into the suburbs. And there was a little bit of loneliness that came with that. So, I really wanted to sort of reflect that sense of loneliness, but that sense of, hey, I'm going to shoot for the stars here because, I need the money.
Now, knowing the story, and I'm not going to spoil anything for anybody, but there's one character I want to ask you about then, but I won't. If it's based on someone you know.
Okay.
I won't ask you. I'll just say the name. I'll say the name of the character.
You got it.
Sally. I'm wondering to what extent Sally did the things as portrayed in your book.
So Sally is based on an actual person that I knew, but she did none of the things that are reflected in the book. She's a much but she really, to me, reflected, she was a single mom who lived in the neighborhood where I grew up. And, she carried all the hopes and dreams that the 80s and living in the 80s in Southern California brought. And I think she really typified that.
The fact that you chose to feature all these different characters, the fact that you chose to use this particular contest from the early 1980s, I don't imagine the story you're telling is, look, it's not simply about, obviously, this folks trying to get this money. In a nutshell, or what is the thing that you want to leave folks with that you're trying to convey in this, using this particular story?
So I appreciate the question. I wanted to capture a very unique time and place, which I think the Mighty 690 does. And I think it uses the radio contest as a vehicle to do that. But, going back to, our earlier conversation about, sort of the social landscape now versus the 1980s, I really wanted to point out, that we've lost this ability to centralize and have commonality around, really cool things, on the radio and on television, and, with all the benefits that come with this decentralization of, media and streaming and, songs on demand, that we've really lost the ability to connect with each other over those things.
You're speaking to the right audience here, because we all long for so much of those days as well. Alex, I want to thank you for talking to us today about your book, The Mighty 690. Certainly, we're going to encourage folks to read it. It's a great story that I think will remind a lot of folks, not only about the sort of different ways our cultures, or the way the culture sort of differed back then, but also about the excitement about a radio contest, plain and simple.
Really, really appreciate it. Appreciate the time. And maybe one of these days we'll hear a radio contest again.
I miss that era, I don't know that this might just speak to my personality, but I don't think that I get so excited about the potential for winning things anymore as I did when I was a teenager. I don't know if that has to, or a younger person. I don't know if that has to do with my age, like I mentioned, or the fact that nothing really leaps out to me, it gets me so excited anymore. And I think because, like we talked with Alex, there's just a deluge of so much. I can't even think who's winning, hearing news stories about folks winning the lottery and those types of things anymore, I don't know. It probably happens. Anyway, I do miss those days of radio contests. And let me know, as I mentioned, what station you listen to around the country, and whether, what they tried to do, or what they did to reach new listeners. You can write to me at will@1980snow.com. And while you're at it, please follow us on whatever podcast platform you're listening to us on right now. Subscribe to us on YouTube. Follow us on Facebook. Those are absolutely 100% free to do, and they really tremendously help our show. Next, on our next episode of 1980s Now, speaking of things from the 1980s, which is what we always do, we're talking about where entertainment is headed today, and whether or not some of the trends we're seeing, some of the scary, dangerous trends we're seeing may be tied to how we consume media in the 1980s. I'll say it that way. Anyway, it's a lot more interesting than what it just sounded like, I think. Anyway, I will talk to you then on 1980s Now.